Star Trek toys are awesome. I've done videos before about Star Trek toys, and I'm a fan of Star Trek toys. While there's always going to be that debate, both as far as content and merchandise, about which one is the most popular, life culture changing property of them all, they both have their place. They're not the same thing, Star Wars and Star Trek, and they both bring a lot to sci fi communities. For me personally, Star Trek Enterprise is actually the show I like the best. And I know that not everyone loves this, and sometimes I'm not quite sure what it is about this show I love so much, but the toys in particular were awesome. The show got better by season 4, but the toys were awesome from day one. Art Asylum did them. They were so articulated. They had the rubber suits. And even if they never released things like Mayweather in his piloting station, which completed the bridge playset, or the fact that Dr. Phlox was only released in the shared body spacesuit buck, if you will, and never his own figure, I still love it. And while I know a lot of people look at Enterprise as the black sheep of the Star Trek universe or Star Trek franchise, what's interesting is that as far as the toy industry goes, Star Trek as a property has kind of become a black sheep at retail, which is interesting because it's not like there's a lack of new content coming out. CBS All Access has their new show, which is extremely toyetic and has a very large audience that love it. But why is it then that Star Trek toys have, for lack of a better word, vanished from retail? I mean, they were an evergreen brand for decades. But now, trying to find them, well, like I said, they've more or less vanished. In the 1960s, you had a lot of label slapping, of course, where existing toys like military figures would just get labeled as Star Trek toys, because everyone remembers when, Captain Kirk and Spock drove that tank. And different role-play toys like helicopter guns could easily just become Star Trek phaser saucer guns because, again, label slapping was pretty easy to do, and TV shows really didn't do that well in the toy aisle. Fast forward to the 70s, when Mego took over the Star Trek license, and you really had a golden age of amazing Star Trek toys. And then, of course, in the 80s, I previously did a video about the awesome Playmates 5-inch line, which, while I touched on a lot of different parts of the line and its importance in pop culture, as far as doing the history of the line, I did it huge injustice, not just because I completely forgot to mention the Galoob and the Earl, but more so the Galoob Next Generation toys, but of course I also butchered Lieutenant Yar's name, and I'm still getting slack on it from the comments, and I deserve every single one of those, because there's nothing worse than a sci-fi fan accidentally mispronouncing a character's name. Believe me, I completely feel like... Okay, well, enough of that. I definitely will not do that again. So let's get back to talking about Star Trek at retail. The last time we had Star Trek at retail, and it's currently 2021 right now, was about 3 years ago when the Mego relaunch had a few different Star Trek figures, including a two-figure box set of Kirk and Spock in the Mirror Universe. So why is it that Star Trek isn't at retail, especially when you have new content coming out? It's not like there isn't a show on the air. Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Enterprises were all TV shows that had toy lines in the main toy aisle. It's not like you have to have a theatrical release to have Star Trek sold in the toy aisle. So what is it that makes the pegs so empty? And, well, I know pegs in general are empty right now, but that's a larger coronavirus lack of Toys R Us issue. Star Trek has gone from an evergreen line that has always been at retail to more or less a pariah that retail shies away from. And lots of people have asked why this is so. Not that I want to focus too much on J.J. Abrams, and I know he's a controversial figure with sci-fi fans, both from Star Trek and Star Wars, but the movie that he did, the relaunch, the Kelvin universe, if you will, I think that's the Kelvin continuity, I believe is the technical geeky term there. I love the first movie, and the first movie did bank. It was the highest grossing Star Wars movie. It outdid, even adjusted for inflation, its opening weekend was gigantic, and it really only compares against the original motion picture in '79 as far as total box office. So you have a really big hit in theaters. So why is it that the toy line didn't take off as well? How can you have a hit movie without a hit toy line? So it's important to look at what Playmates was doing with the toy lines in 2009. So the next generation line, the 5-inch figures, had kind of long been retired from retail, and Playmates essentially relaunched Star Trek collecting with new lines that were in 3 different scales. So first off, you had the Galaxy collection, which was 3 3/4 figures, which essentially were compatible with things like Star Wars, which was 3 3/4. Then you had the Warp collection, which were 6-inch figures, essentially compatible with things like Marvel Legends or DCU Classics, Masters of the Universe Classics, Black Series. Although I don't think Black Series was around at the time. Did it come out in 2009? I can't recall. But, your standard 6-inch figures. And this is what allowed more detail, like actually having the scribe lines on the uniforms, added articulation, better portraits being the industry term for a head sculpt. And then there was a third line that were 12-inch figures with cloth outfits called the Command line. So again, existing 12-inch collectors, this is an absolute scale people collect in, and now you could get Star Trek figures for the '09 movie in this scale to put with the rest of your collection or to start a brand new Star Trek collection. Cloth outfits, really good portrait sculpts, removable accessories, everything you would expect from a 12-inch line. And then finally there was Roleplay, which was sold at essentially the same price point as the 6-inch, but were scaled for, obviously humans, not action figures. So why is it that the line ended, especially when Wave 2 for several of the lines was shown and previewed, which was going to have new sculpts, new figures that were fully tooled? Why did it fail? Why is it that the Star Trek line suddenly came to a halt? Well, obviously it was sales, but the rationale was that balance between kid and adult. So I've mentioned before in my Star Trek videos about how Star Trek absolutely skews older. But when you have a movie line, it's important to skew a little bit more towards kids. And scale is also very important when balancing the difference between kid and collector. And, well, this Star Trek line had a lot of scales. Like every scale, 3 3/4, 6-inch, 12-inch. Yeah, they're all existing scales, but they're all the scales. And while Playmates was focusing on scales that were currently being collected out there by adults and by kids, they kind of neglected the most important scale of all, the one that holds candy. I mean, the one that their previous figures were done in, which was the 5-inch scale. So when you're dealing with adults, the collecting doesn't end. So a lot of adult collectors had already invested in an entire Star Trek universe in 5-inch scale. Granted, most figure lines aren't in this scale, but Star Trek is and or was, and everyone's existing collection was at this form factor. So introducing new form factors, meaning new scales, 3 3/4, 6-inch, well, those are fantastic, and it's great for people who collect by scale. For the existing fan base, they couldn't fit these figures in. So a lot of the items that were planned for Wave 2, which included things like young preteen Spock from the flashback scenes or old post-adult Spock, the two extremes of Spock, when he shows up in the ice cave for reasons with the torch, as well as the different outfits that he wore in the Starfleet scenes. Well, all of this was planned, including ideas of doing the original cast in 3 3/4 and continuing this as kind of the new definitive scale. But as much as a new scale is great, collectors are invested. In fact, they even had another scale planned, which was going to be the Starfleet Command scale. I'm sorry, the Starfleet Defenders scale, which was going to be kind of like the play school, little super morph figures for kids. So here was a 4th scale that was planned to be introduced on top of the 3 already existing ones. And the thing is, fans and retail are just like elephants. They're big, they like peanuts, and they never forget and often never forgive, shall we say. I mean, sometimes they forgive. Meaning, once you kind of betray their expectations, whether it be by scale Or as far as revenue, well, retail calls that being delisted, meaning if a line does not perform to expectations, it's removed from aisle. And that was the case. Now, this can be reversed. I mean, healing does take time, and that's also true in the toy industry. You can absolutely bring a brand back to retail that's been delisted, or through one reason or another, in this case, the wrong scale, sort of, shall we say, offended collectors. A good example is Masters of the Universe. The 2000X line that was put out in 2001, 2002 for the Mike Young series did very poorly at retail, and it was quickly removed. It was delisted. Even though collectors liked it, it didn't perform to retail expectations. And look, it's now 2021, and Masters of the Universe is back at retail. So healing can happen, fans can forgive, retailers can forgive, and they are willing to take another chance on a property that didn't meet expectations, both revenue and collectability. But it does take time, and as an example, the last time Masters of the Universe was at retail, VHSs were included with the figures. So there's food for thought for a timeline of how long sometimes retail takes to give another shot to a brand. So can the enterprise boldly go back to retail? Absolutely. It'll take time, but the fan base is never going to give up, and its evergreen reputation will help it remain an important toy property. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it shared some insights, and I hope all is forgiven for my mispronunciation of Lieutenant Yar. Hope you want to share this, like it, and subscribe, because it tells YouTube to share it with more people. That's how their algorithm works. Thanks for watching.